Hey guys, tonight we're taking a long, sleepy walk back through the mud-soaked tracks of medieval Europe. So, dim the lights, pull the blanket a little closer, and let's talk about something very few people ever think about. Because here's the thing: when we picture the Middle Ages, we usually imagine castles, knights, and some guy in shiny armor yelling for the king. But the truth is, most people weren't living in castles. They weren't even anywhere near castles. They were peasants, and peasants didn't exactly get the red carpet treatment when they traveled. So, where did they stay? Did they have inns? Cozy hotels? Room service? No, unless you count sleeping in a barn while trying not to get kicked by a cow as five-star accommodation. Travel was rare for peasants. Most of them stayed within a day's walk of their village for their entire lives. But sometimes they had to move pilgrimages, market trips, family emergencies, or, fleeing from a plague-ridden town. And when that happened, peasants faced the eternal question: where do you crash for the night when you're broke, muddy, and carrying nothing but a sack of onions? The answer was anywhere that would take you. Churches, barns, and sometimes even under bridges. Monasteries were actually a common stop. Monks, bound by rules of hospitality, would feed and shelter travelers. Of course, the monks didn't exactly roll out fluffy duvets and feather pillows. Think more like, here's a straw mat in a cold stone hall. Good luck. And then there were inns. But inns weren't the charming taverns you see in fantasy shows. Most were noisy, filthy, and packed with strangers. You'd share a bed with whoever showed up, sometimes 2 or 3 people deep. Complete strangers, all pressed together. Lice were free of charge, and privacy never heard of her. Of course, the wealthy had the luxury of guest rooms in noble houses, but peasants, they had the wide, open generosity of anyone who would let them in for the night. Or, failing that, a pile of hay. And honestly, hay wasn't the worst option. So let's float along to another corner of medieval travel. The strange, uncomfortable world of communal sleeping. So, let's say you've made it to an inn. Congratulations, you're alive. Your shoes are only mostly falling apart, and you haven't been robbed yet. But now comes the fun part: going to bed. Now, in our world, a bad night might mean a lumpy mattress, or maybe the hotel forgot to give you extra pillows. In the Middle Ages, a bad night meant crawling into a bed with 3 strangers, all of whom smelled like wet sheep. And yes, that was normal. Beds were scarce, wood was expensive, and rooms were tiny. So if you wanted a spot, you shared. 2 peasants might lie head to toe, while a third just sort of wedged in sideways. Blankets weren't guaranteed, and if you were lucky enough to get one, it was already damp with the sweat of whoever used it before. Romantic, right? And the noises. Oh, the noises. Imagine snoring, coughing, wheezing, scratching, because let's be real, everyone had Flesian, the occasional midnight fart chorus. Honestly, sleeping outside in the hay might have been more peaceful, but inns weren't just beds. They were the social hubs of the road. You'd find merchants shouting about their wares, traveling musicians singing badly in the corner, and occasionally, the drunk guy who decided the fireplace was his bed for the night. It was messy, chaotic, and very human. Still, for peasants who rarely traveled, the sheer novelty of being somewhere new, with people from faraway villages, probably added a strange sense of wonder. Sure, you were miserable, but at least you were miserable together. And speaking of being miserable together, let's wander into the world of medieval hospitality rules, where hosts were legally or spiritually obligated to take you in, even if they hated every second of it. In medieval Europe, if you were poor and wandering, your survival didn't just depend on your stamina. It depended on other people's guilt. Hospitality wasn't just a nice thing, it was practically a duty. The Bible, church rules, and local customs all reminded people that turning away a traveler could mean turning away Christ himself. And nobody wanted to be that guy on Judgment Day. So, Peasants on the move might knock on a door and hope for the best. Sometimes a family would squeeze you into their one-room hut, with the pigs snuffling in the corner and the baby crying in the other. Cozy. Other times, you'd be told to move along before the dogs were unleashed. It was always a gamble. Monasteries, those who were more reliable. Pilgrims, especially, could count on monks to hand over bread, soup, and maybe a spot on the floor. But again, don't picture anything luxurious. Picture cold stone, a thin blanket, and a monk giving you the side eye because you definitely smell like you haven't bathed in a month. Which of course, you hadn't. And then there were the bigger guest houses attached to abbeys, set up specifically for travelers. They were meant to be charitable. But in practice, they often became overcrowded, full of the sick, the desperate, and the vaguely suspicious. Basically, an early version of the world's saddest hostel. Now, if you happened to be traveling through certain regions, laws required towns to provide space for travelers. Sounds nice in theory. In practice, it usually meant cramming a stranger into your attic or barn and hoping they didn't steal your tools. People weren't thrilled about it, but hey, nothing says community spirit like being forced to share your bed with a coughing stranger. So yes, peasants could rely on the kindness or grudging obligation of others. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept them moving. And as we drift forward, let us peek at one of the strangest travel traditions, the endless world of roadside shrines and pilgrim stops. If you were a peasant on the move, chances are you weren't heading to a spa weekend. You were probably trudging along a pilgrimage route, hoping to shave off a few centuries in purgatory. Lucky you. The medieval world was full of shrine-steiny chapels, wooden crosses, or even just a rock that someone decided was holy. And each shrine came with a little ecosystem of hospitality. Locals might set up stalls selling bread, ale, or a miraculous cure that looked suspiciously like yesterday's goat fat. You'd rest, maybe light a candle, and then shuffle on. Bigger pilgrimage centers think Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or Rome where, even better, they had purpose-built hospitals and hospices for travelers. Hospital didn't mean modern medicine though. It meant a place where you could get fed, prayed over, and hopefully not die in the corner. Still, compared to sleeping in a ditch, it was progress. And peasants didn't just travel alone. Pilgrim groups formed along the way, bands of strangers walking together for safety. After all, medieval roads were basically crime highways. Traveling alone was an invitation to be robbed by bandits or shaken down by local lords who decided your shoes were now his shoes. So pilgrim stops weren't just about religion, they were about survival. They gave you food, a roof, and the faint hope that you wouldn't be stabbed in the night. Inspiring, right? But here's the funny part. While the poor were huddling in drafty hospices, the wealthy pilgrims, knights, nobles, or the occasional royal got treated like VIPs, silk sheets, banquets, servants, all for walking the same road. Same blisters, wildly different vibes. So as we yawn our way through the world of medieval travel, let's shuffle on to another awkward reality. What did peasants actually eat on the road? Spoiler, it wasn't good. So, you're on the road, tired, hungry, and carrying about 3 coins and half a loaf of bread. What's for dinner? The short answer, whatever you could stuff into your sack before leaving home, and whatever you didn't lose to thieves or dogs along the way. Peasant travel food was simple. Rye bread, hard cheese, maybe some dried peas or beans. Things that wouldn't rot instantly, though they'd definitely grow harder than bricks. If you had a little luck, maybe some salted pork or dried fish, though that was more of a treat-yourself situation. Mostly, it was carbs, and more carbs. Ale was common to water on the road, was risky as streams were full of things that would make your stomach regret being alive. Ale was safer, though it meant trudging mile after mile while mildly tipsy. Honestly, that might have been the only thing that made the trip bearable. Now, if you stopped at an inn, you might get a hot meal, which sounds great, until you remember That hot meal often meant a pot of mystery stew, with every traveler's scraps tossed in. Picture cabbage, onions, bones, and maybe a rat if the cook wasn't paying attention. Delicious. And if you had no food at all, begging was an option. Pilgrims especially had the excuse of holiness. People were supposed to feed those walking for God. Of course, sometimes they just threw you an old crust and slammed the door. Generosity had its limits, so the road diet was survival, not enjoyment. No spices, no variety, no Instagram-worthy feasts. Just enough to keep you walking, slowly, painfully. And speaking of painfully, let's wander over to the glamorous subject of medieval footwear. Because nothing says travel nightmare like shoes that were basically sacks of leather tied with string. Let's talk about shoes. Or, well, the medieval attempt at shoes. Because honestly, calling them shoes feels generous. For most peasants, footwear was just rough leather stitched together, barely shaped to a foot. No padding, no arch support, nothing resembling comfort. If you've ever worn stiff new boots that rub your heel raw, imagine that, but permanently. And then imagine walking 20 miles in the rain with them. Shoes were expensive, too. Some peasants couldn't afford them at all, so they just walked barefoot until their soles became basically calloused leather. Which sounds tough, but it didn't protect against sharp stones, frozen mud, or the delightful squish of animal droppings. If you did have shoes, they wore out quickly on the rough roads. Holes appeared, stitching snapped, and suddenly you were inventing medieval duct tape string, scraps of cloth, or just stuffing hay inside to keep your feet from freezing. Fashionable? No. Practical? Barely. Blisters were constant companions. So were cuts that got infected, because this was a world without antibiotics. One bad wound on your foot could end your journey or your life, which is why so many pilgrim shrines advertised healing miracles. Coincidence? Probably not. And then there was the weather. Rain turned roads into swamps, snow froze your toes, and summer heat baked your feet inside those sweaty leather sacks. Every step was either too wet, too cold, or too hot. Basically, no one was ever comfortable. So yes, travel in the Middle Ages wasn't about adventure, it was about surviving your own shoes. And yet, people still went, out of duty, desperation, or the occasional strange craving for religious brownie points. Now, let's drift forward a little into the wider dangers of the road bandits, tolls, and all the lovely ways medieval peasants were reminded that life wasn't fair. So, let's say your feet haven't given up yet. You're walking along, clutching your crust of bread, when suddenly welcome to the next problem: other people. Medieval roads were not safe. Bandits lurked in forests and ditches, waiting for unlucky travelers. They weren't looking for treasure, because peasants didn't have treasure. They were looking for shoes, cloaks, food, anything that could be resold or eaten. Yes, you could literally get robbed of your dinner. Tragic. And if the bandits didn't get you, the tolls might. Local lords built little checkpoints along the road, then demanded money for you to pass. Sometimes this was legal. Often it was just a knight with a sword saying, "Nice shoes, those are mine now." Either way, your journey became slower, poorer, and angrier. Churches sometimes tried to protect travelers. Certain routes were declared safe for pilgrims under holy protection. But let's be real, bandits didn't care much about PayPal blessings. If they wanted your onions, they were taking them. Traveling in groups was safer. Pilgrims and merchants often banded together for protection. Of course, that also meant moving at the speed of the slowest, hungriest, or most dramatic member of the group. And every group had one. And then there were wild animals. Wolves, bears, or just the village dogs that decided you looked biddable. It wasn't constant danger, but it was always possible. Which meant sleeping outside wasn't just uncomfortable, was a little risky. So yes, danger was everywhere. And yet peasants kept walking, because sometimes there was no choice. A wedding, a funeral, a market, or a holy shrine, you went. where you had to, and hoped you came back alive. Now, while peasants risked life and limb just to reach the next town, the nobility were out here traveling with wagons, servants, and feather beds. So let's take a soft little detour into the absurdly pampered journeys of medieval elites. While peasants were busy dodging bandits and sleeping in barns, the nobility had a very different travel experience. Spoiler, it was not humble. When a noble set out, it looked less like going on a journey and more like moving a small city. Carriages, wagons, horses, servants, cooks, guards, sometimes even musicians rolled along the road like a parade. And yes, of course, they complained the entire way. Beds they brought them, feather mattresses, embroidered sheets, curtains to keep out drafts. Whole tents were packed just to recreate a mini bedroom wherever they stopped. Compare that to peasants, who were thrilled if they found a dry haystack. Food. Nobles traveled with kitchens on wheels. Servants roasted meat, baked bread, and carried spices, because God forbid a count had to eat unseasoned cabbage like the commoners. Even wine traveled with them, stored in barrels that rattled along the road. Meanwhile, peasants were sipping warm ale and chewing on crusts that could double as doorstops. And when nobles stayed at inns, they didn't share beds with strangers. Entire rooms would be cleared, peasants shoved out, and the noble's entourage would take over. Inns loved its status, plus money. Travelers already in the room probably didn't love it as much. Of course, noble travel wasn't risk-free. Bandits usually avoided them, but not always. Sometimes rival nobles treated guests as convenient hostages. Even the weather didn't care about your title. The countess stuck in the mud was still stuck in the mud though. At least she had servants to yank her out. So yes, noble travel was inconvenient at worst, but it was never truly miserable. And if it was, they certainly wrote long, dramatic letters about it. Because nothing says privilege like complaining about the softness of your goose feather pillow. And while nobles fussed over their luxuries, peasants kept trudging along, inventing clever little ways to survive the road. Which brings us gently into the world of peasant travel hacks, the low-budget, medieval version of life hacks. So, what do you do when you're broke, cold, and trying to walk 50 miles on a diet of stale bread? You get creative. Medieval peasants had plenty of tiny tricks to make the road just a little less unbearable. For starters, clothing doubled as luggage. Cloaks weren't just for warmth, they were basically portable sleeping bags. A good wool cloak could be wrapped around you at night, keeping out the wind and the rain. Not glamorous, but it beat freezing to death. As for carrying things, most peasants didn't have proper bags. They tied up bundles in cloth, slung them over a stick, or just strapped items directly to their belts. Think hobo chic, but without the chic. Shoes stuffed with straw made winter journeys bearable well, at least survivable. And then there was the art of begging strategically. Pilgrims learned which towns were generous and which ones were stingy. Some even carried little wooden badges or tokens showing which saint they were walking for, because apparently people were more likely to feed you if you advertised that you were suffering for holy reasons. Clever marketing, medieval style. Traveling in groups was another hack. Sure, it was slower, but it meant you could share food, take turns keeping watch, and pool your coins at inn. Plus, there was safety in numbers. Bandits were less likely to attack a whole crowd of scruffy, onion-carrying peasants. And when all else failed, you slept wherever you could. Barns, porches, churchyards, even under wagons. Anywhere that offered a little shelter from the rain. Privacy didn't exist, comfort didn't exist, but survival did. So, peasants didn't travel well, but they did travel smart out of necessity. Every mile was a small battle against hunger, weather, and sore feet. Which brings us to one of the most quietly miserable parts of peasant journeys. The roads themselves. Because believe it or not, sometimes the road wasn't much of a road at all. So, let's imagine you're a peasant, finally ready for your big journey. You've packed your bread, your cloak, and your optimism. Now all you need is a road. Good luck with that. Because medieval roads were often just paths, dirt tracks carved out by carts and animals, beaten down until they were technically usable except when it rained, which was always. Then they turned into mud rivers, deep ruts filled with water. Wagons got stuck, shoes got sucked right off your feet. Imagine losing your only pair of shoes to a puddle. Tragic. Bridges were scarce, and the ones that did exist weren't always reliable. A wooden bridge might collapse if too many people crossed, or if it hadn't been repaired since, say, the reign of Charlemagne, which meant a lot of travelers had to wade through rivers, cold, wet, and very dangerous if you couldn't swim. Spoiler, most peasants couldn't. Winter made things worse. Snow and ice made paths invisible. You'd trudge along, hoping you were still on the right track, while secretly wondering if you were just wandering into someone's field to freeze quietly behind a hedge. Even in good weather, roads were littered with obstacles, fallen trees, deep holes, wandering animals, the occasional rotting carcass of a horse. All the little details that made every journey feel like an endurance test. And yet, these same roads carried kings, queens, merchants, armies, and pilgrims. Everyone used them, just at very different levels of misery. A noble's wagon train would grind through the mud, servants pushing the wheels, while peasants slogged alongside on foot. Same road, wildly different experience. So yes, the roads weren't built for comfort. They were built by necessity, and half the time, they barely worked. But hey, at least they gave us an endless supply of complaints in medieval chronicles. And speaking of endless complaints, let's slide into the world of medieval inns in a little more detail, because those places were a story all by themselves. So, you've survived the mud, dodged the tolls, and stumbled into a village. Lucky youth, there's an inn. At last, a roof over your head. But don't get too excited. Medieval inns were, let's call them, an experience. First problem, space. Inns were small, and demand was high. That meant crowding. One room might hold 20 people, jammed together on benches, pallets, or just the floor. If you wanted privacy, you should have stayed home. Second problem, cleanliness, or rather, the total absence of it. Floors covered in rushes that hadn't been changed since the last saint's feast day. Fleas, lice, ratsins, had it all, free of charge. Beds, if they existed, were shared. And yes, that meant climbing under the same blanket as 2 or 3 strangers who smelled like they'd been herding goats for a month. Spoiler, they probably had. Third problem, food. Inns served meals, but meal was a generous word. Think thin stew, heavy bread, and ale watered down so far it was basically sad brown water. If you were lucky, you might get a chunk of meat floating in there. If you were unlucky, it was probably mystery meat. But inns weren't just about food and shelter. They were the social hubs of the road. Merchants haggled, pilgrims traded stories of miracles they definitely didn't see, and drunk locals loudly tried to sing in the corner. It was noisy, smoky, and chaotic, but also lively in a way most peasants never experienced back home. Of course, trouble came to inns were prime spots for theft, fights, and the occasional stabbing over whose turn it was with the blanket. Some towns even tried regulating inns because they got such a bad reputation. Imagine being so bad at hosting guests that medieval city officials had to step in. So yes, inns kept people alive, but barely. A roof and some watery ale weren't luxury, they were survival. And yet, compared to a cold ditch by the roadside, even a filthy inn could feel like paradise. Next, let's drift into monasteries again, but this time, not just as spiritual pit stops. Because monasteries were basically the medieval version of budget hotels, with monks as your reluctant hosts. If inns were chaotic, monasteries were the opposite. At least in theory. For peasants on the road, monasteries were one of the few places you could reliably knock on the door and not get chased away with a stick. Hospitality was part of the deal. Monks were supposed to welcome strangers as if they were welcoming Christ himself, which, if you've ever smelled the medieval pilgrim's feet, was probably the ultimate test of faith. Now, let's be clear, this didn't mean luxury. Travelers didn't get tucked into little monk cells with warm candles and neat blankets. More often, they were given a bare corner in a hall, some straw on the floor, and maybe a thin blanket, if the monastery could spare one. Privacy, none. Comfort, minimal. Warmth, questionable. Food was simple too. Bread, broth, maybe some beans. Enough to keep you alive, not enough to impress you. Though, compared to whatever suspicious stew was bubbling at the local inn, monastery food might have felt like an upgrade. And at least you didn't have to pay. Hospitality was offered for free, though donations were always welcome. The monks themselves probably weren't thrilled about this system. Imagine trying to live a peaceful life of prayer, only to have half a dozen muddy travelers snoring in the guest hall every night. But rules were rules, and hospitality was sacred. So peasants on the move knew monasteries were their safest bet. Some monasteries even built official guest houses. These were meant to separate the holy monks from the not-so-holy masses of travelers, beggars, and the occasional suspicious wanderer. A sort of medieval please stay in your lane arrangement. Still, it was better than the ditch. So yes, monasteries kept countless peasants alive on their journeys. Not comfortable, not glamorous, but reliable. And in a world where so much was uncertain, reliability was a blessing. And speaking of blessings, let's wander next into the curious world of pilgrim hostels and hospitals, which sound medical, but were really just more ways to cram too many tired bodies into too little space. Now, monasteries weren't the only option for a peasant traveler. Pilgrimage was such a big deal in the Middle Ages that entire networks of hostels and hospitals popped up along the main routes. And when I say hospital, don't imagine white sheets and doctors in neat uniforms. Imagine a big hall full of coughing strangers, some wooden benches, and a monk trying to hand out soup while silently regretting his life choices. These places were designed to keep pilgrims alive long enough to reach the shrine, which, frankly, was good marketing. After all, no saint wanted a trail of dead peasants lining the road to their church, so you'd find these hostels near holy sites, at crossroads, or along famous pilgrimage paths. Inside, things were simple. Rows of straw beds or mats, food ladled from a pot, and maybe some basic medical care. If medical care means a priest rubbing ointment on your sores and praying really hard. Still, for peasants who were usually left to fend for themselves, it was a rare safety net. And here's the funny part. Not everyone staying there was actually a pilgrim. Some people just pretended to be. Because if calling yourself a pilgrim meant free food and a roof over your head, suddenly everyone had a deep spiritual calling. Medieval grifters working the system centuries before it was cool. Conditions weren't great though. Overcrowding was constant. Diseases spread quickly. And the food was usually the same thin broth on repeat. But it was still better than shivering in a ditch, while wolves howled in the distance. The bar was low. So between monasteries, hostels, and the occasional inn, peasants stitched together enough options to make long journeys possible. Barely. Which brings us softly to another part of the road life. Who exactly was traveling? Because contrary to the stereotype, it wasn't just the poor trudging around. Sometimes even royals and elites took to the road, and in a very different style. So, while monasteries and pilgrim hostels were options, sometimes a peasant had no choice but to stop at a tavern. Now, don't let the word tavern trick you into picturing a cozy pub with wooden beams and frothy mugs of ale. These were more like chaotic wooden sheds where you could buy watery beer, questionable stew, and maybe, just maybe, a straw corner to collapse into. Taverns loved travelers. Why? Because travelers were desperate. You've been walking all day, your feet feel like raw turnips. And then you see a lantern outside a roadside shack promising food and warmth. Of course you're going to stumble in, even if it means emptying the only coin you've got. But here's the catch. Tavern keepers weren't exactly famous for honesty. You might pay for a bed and discover the bed was just a patch of floor space between a drunk shepherd and someone as snoring goat. You might order stew and realize the meat was a bone boiled for the third time that week, and yet people kept coming back. Because, again, the alternative was sleeping outside with a charming combination of rain, rats, and the occasional highwayman, and taverns were rowdy. Unlike monasteries, where silence was holy, taverns were full of shouting, dice games, singing, and at least one argument breaking out in the corner. For peasants, who lived such quiet, labor-heavy lives, that chaos could feel both overwhelming and, secretly, kind of exciting. Of course, if you didn't have a coin to spare, you might try to barter your way in. A chicken, a sack of grain, even just labor. Tavern keepers sometimes let people stay if they could scrub pots or chop wood. So peasants got creative. Survival was about trading whatever you had, even if what you had was just two tired hands and a willingness to haul buckets. And that, in its own messy way, made taverns part of the medieval travel web. Not reliable, not holy, but always there, lurking along the roadside, waiting for the next muddy traveler to wander in. When monasteries were full, hostels too far away, and taverns too expensive, peasants had one last fallback, finding some random patch of shelter and hoping no one kicked them out. Barns were the classic choice. If you were lucky, a kindly farmer might let you sleep in the hayloft. Warmth, cover, and maybe a cow staring at you in mild judgment. Honestly, not the worst option. Of course, kindly farmer wasn't guaranteed. If you snuck in without permission, there was always the risk of being discovered. And peasants weren't shy about protecting their hay. A pitchfork jab in the middle of the night was a very real possibility. So, if you were sneaky, you curled up quietly, praying the chickens didn't give you away. Just an open patch of ground. Lay your cloak down, hug your bundle of belongings, and hope the dew didn't soak you by morning. This was survival stripped down to the basics. The earth as your mattress, the sky as your ceiling, and every strange rustle in the dark, convincing you it was probably wolves. Some travelers carried little mats or cloaks, specifically for this, not because it was comfortable, but because even the thinnest barrier between your body and the cold ground mattered. And peasants learned tricks. Sleeping near a hedge or ditch gave you a bit of cover from the wind. Sleeping near a road, not so smart, unless you wanted your belongings mysteriously gone by sunrise. The real irony. For some peasants, this wasn't very different from home. Houses in poor villages were one-room huts with straw floors anyway. Sleeping rough on the road wasn't a shocking downgrade. It was just the same struggle, with slightly more uncertainty. And yet, people still traveled, to markets, to shrines, to festivals. They accepted the discomfort, because life in medieval Europe was uncomfortable pretty much everywhere. On the road, off the road, the line between home and away was surprisingly thin. When all else failed, peasants could try the mercy of the local parish church. Churches, even tiny village chapels, were supposed to embody Christian charity, which meant, in theory, that a wandering traveler could knock on the priest's door and ask for a corner to rest. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes you got a warm bowl of pottage and a bench to curl up on. Other times you got a lecture about sin and told to move along. Medieval hospitality was inconsistent. Let's say, there was also the option of simply begging, not for money, but for lodging. Peasants on the road might go door to door in villages along the way, asking for a spot by the fire or a patch of straw in an outbuilding. The kindness of strangers was the medieval equivalent of Airbnb, but without the clean sheets, safety guarantees, or 5-star ratings. Now, there's an interesting little paradox here. Hospitality was considered a Christian duty. People believed that turning away a traveler might mean turning away Christ himself in disguise. But reality was more complicated. If the village had just been raided, or famine was hitting hard, Suddenly, Christian charity became sorry. Try the next town. So, peasants learned to read the mood before they asked. Travelers sometimes carried little tokens or charms that marked them as pilgrims, because a pilgrim was more likely to get help than a random wanderer. A badge of St. James, for example, might open more doors than an empty hand. It was a subtle form of branding. Medieval marketing, if you will. Pretend you're walking for God, and people feed you. And for the most desperate, there was always the church porch. Even if no one took you in, you could huddle under the roof outside, sheltered from rain. It wasn't dignified, but then again, dignity was a luxury few peasants could afford. So, between monasteries, taverns, barns, fields, parish porches, and sheer luck, peasants scraped together their travel lodging like a patchwork quilt, which sets us up nicely to contrast all of this mud-soaked improvisation with the way nobles moved across the same landscape. Traveling alone in medieval Europe was basically asking for trouble. The roads weren't just muddy and tiring, they were dangerous. Bandits lurked in forests, wolves prowled at night, and desperate beggars could turn into desperate thieves if the mood struck. So peasants learned quickly that the safest way to travel was in groups. Markets, pilgrimages, and fairs gave them the perfect excuse. If 5 families were all heading to the same festival, they band together. A cluster of travelers with walking sticks and farm tools was a much less tempting target than one poor soul dragging along by himself. Strength in numbers wasn't just a proverb, it was survival math. Group travel also meant sharing resources. One person might carry a cooking pot, another a spare cloak, another some dried beans. Pool it all together, and suddenly you had a traveling kitchen, a bit of warmth, and maybe even a song or two to keep spirits up. It wasn't luxury, but it was less miserable than going it alone. There was also a psychological comfort. Walking for days on muddy roads was boring and exhausting. Having company made it bearable. Someone to swap stories with, someone to complain about the blisters with, someone to make you laugh at the absurdity of trudging through yet another puddle. And then there was the practical part, watch duty. When the group camped in a barn, a ditch, or even out in a field, someone always had to stay awake, to guard the belongings, to scare off the stray thief, to poke the fire when it started dying. Alone, you'd fall asleep and wake up robbed, if you woke up at all. In a group, at least you could take turns staying miserable, while everyone else got some rest. So for peasants, group travel was the closest thing they had to insurance. A fragile shield of numbers against a world that didn't take care if they made it to their destination. And with that picture in place, tired peasants trudging together in little clusters, pooling scraps, huddling in barns, we can now drift across the same landscape to the other side. The noble caravans, the moving palaces, the medieval version of rolling up with a 5-star hotel on wheels. For peasants, the road wasn't just long and uncomfortable. It was mysterious. Forests were full of shadows, crossroads carried strange reputations, and every ruined chapel or crooked tree seemed to have a story. So, naturally, travelers armed themselves not just with walking sticks, but with charms and prayers. Some carried tiny relics, or at least what they believed were relics. A scrap of cloth said to belong to a saint, a pebble from a holy spring, a feather, supposedly from an angel's wing, though more likely from a chicken. These tokens gave comfort, even if their protective powers were, let's say, unverified. Prayers were constant companions too. Before setting out, peasants might kneel at the village cross and mutter a plea for safety. On the road, passing a church or shrine meant another quick sign of the cross, just in case. And if they stumbled on a wayside crucifix, they'd often leave a pebble or flower as a little offering. Insurance policies, medieval style, superstitions filled the gaps where faith left off. Some believed you shouldn't sleep at a crossroads, or spirits might bother you. Others swore that whistling at night would attract demons. And more practically, there was a common trick of putting iron under your sleeping spot, a knife or horseshoe. to ward off evil. Even if it didn't scare spirits, at least it was handy if an actual thief showed up. Of course, plenty of peasants weren't above mixing religion with sheer folk magic. A muttered charm here, a saint's name there, and suddenly you had a full spiritual toolkit against wolves, bandits, and bad weather. Did it work? Well, they kept doing it, so it must have felt like it did. So in the end, peasant travel was never just about the physical journey. It was layered with faith, fear, and a touch of magic. And all of this, the barns, the begging, the charms, sets the stage for a delicious contrast. Because when nobles traveled the same roads, they brought a very different set of baggage. Silk tents, gold plate, and enough servants to carry both. After all this talk of mud, barns, and thin soup, it's worth pausing to ask, why did peasants even bother traveling at all? Why risk the blisters, the thieves, and the awkward night in a stranger's hayloft? The answer, in a sleepy sort of way, is that life at home was often so hard and monotonous that even the road, with all its risks, felt like a break. Markets were the most practical reason. Local villages only had so much to offer. But a big market in a nearby town, that was where you could sell surplus grain, buy salt or cloth, and hear news from far-off places. It was commerce, yes, but also community. A kind of medieval social media feed. Except instead of scrolling, you walked for 3 days to hear gossip. Festivals were another lure. Religious feasts, saints' days, or seasonal fairs offered music, games, and food that peasants didn't normally get. Imagine trudging 20 miles just to see jugglers, dancing, and a roast pig. That's what counted as a once-in-a-lifetime event, when most days were just hoeing fields. And of course, there were shrines. Pilgrimages might sound grand, but for many peasants, they were short and local. Walking to the next town to touch a relic or light a candle was believed to bring blessings. For health, for crops, for family, a way of investing spiritual energy, if not coin. So peasants walked. They endured the mud, the barns, the strange beds, because the destinations gave them something their daily grind could not. A glimpse of wonder, a chance to be part of something bigger, or, at the very least, the possibility of a decent meal at the end of the road. And with that, we can gently leave the peasants by their smoky fires and creaky barns, and drift toward the other side of the medieval road. The nobles, the kings, the moving courts that turned simple journeys into parades of wealth and chaos. Picture it. A handful of peasants trudging along, carrying bundles on their backs, muttering prayers under their breath. They're sore, hungry, and hoping tonight's barn is free of rats. Then, from behind them, they hear a rumble. Not thunder, not carts, but an entire procession. Because here comes a noble entourage. Horses with jingling bridles, wagons loaded with trunks, servants, guards, and maybe even a musician or two. For the peasants, it was both awe-inspiring and deeply annoying. On one hand, you got a front-row seat to wealth you could barely imagine. Silks, banners, and a noble dressed like he was about to walk onto a tapestry. On the other hand, the road suddenly belonged to them. You, the peasant, were expected to step aside, into the mud. Because of course you were. Sometimes, if you were lucky, a noble caravan might toss scraps or coins to peasants who cleared the way. More often, they just rolled past, leaving dust or worse, wheels splattering muck straight into your face. It was a reminder that you and they were traveling the same path, but not the same world. And yet, these encounters mattered. For peasants, seeing nobility on the move was one of the rare moments where they glimpsed the ruling class up close. Not on a throne, not in a castle, just on the road, vulnerable in their own way. Though surrounded by so many attendants, it was hard to imagine. So while peasants scrounged for hay and begged at church porches, nobles built entire moving courts to carry their comfort with them. And this is where we can finally drift into the absurd contrasts. Silk tents, feather beds, and kitchens on wheels. The medieval version of dragging your entire house along just to avoid one night of roughing it. If peasants were lucky to snag a barn corner, nobles made sure the road bent to their comfort. A nobleman didn't just travel. He staged an event. Picture a small army of retainers, wagons, horses, cooks, and servants, all lumbering along like a parade no one asked for. The noble himself, of course, rode on horseback. Not a tired, scruffy pony, but a well-groomed destrier or palfrey, decked out in fine tack. His cloak flowed behind him, probably impractical, but that was the point. Nobles traveled to be seen. Even on the road, image mattered. Behind him came the wagons. And oh, the wagons, packed with feather mattresses, wooden chests, silver goblets, and tapestries, because apparently even the countryside needed interior decorating. You couldn't expect a noble to stare at bare stone walls or, God forbid, sleep on plain straw. Food was another circus. Nobles often brought entire kitchens with them, not just pots and pans, but actual cooks, firewood, and spices. Spices were the big flex. Where peasants got thin broth, nobles demanded roasted meat seasoned with pepper or saffron, even in the middle of nowhere. And servants had to scramble to make it happen, no matter how ridiculous. And then there was the entertainment. Musicians sometimes rode along, ready to pluck a lute at a moment's notice. Jesters, too, if the Lord liked a laugh. The road wasn't just a way to get from point A to B. It was an extension of court life, complete with distractions. The size of these entourages varied, but even small noble trips involved dozens of people. Larger ones, hundreds. It turned narrow medieval roads into moving blockages. Imagine being a peasant waiting to get by with your cart of turnips, while a count's baggage train clogged the way for an hour. Not exactly efficient. So where peasants scraped together survival, nobles turned travel into a performance. Heavy, slow, extravagant, but always reminding everyone who held the power. For nobles, travel wasn't supposed to feel like travel at all. It was supposed to feel like dragging home along with them, which meant one thing above all else. The bed came to a feather mattress, stuffed with down or wool, carefully packed into a wagon. Nobles didn't do straw in a barn. They expected to sink into softness every night, even if the wagon had to creak under the weight. Baths were another indulgence. A copper or wooden tub could be hauled along, set up wherever the entourage stopped. Heated water was fetched, perfumes and oils unpacked, while peasants rinsed their feet in a stream and called it a day. A noble might soak in scented water while attendants hovered nearby with towels. It was less roughing it and more spa day with horses parked outside. Privacy mattered, too. Nobles didn't like the idea of sleeping in crowded hostels with strangers. So tents came along. Not the simple cloth shelters of peasants, but elaborate constructions with silk hangings, carpets on the ground, and furniture carried in piece by piece. Some of these traveling tents looked more like portable palaces than temporary shelters. Religion traveled with them as well. Many nobles carried small portable chapels, or at least a chest with relics and a priest in tow. Morning prayers, evening mass, blessings before meals, all could be performed on the road, because holiness was easier to maintain when you brought the church along. And of course, clothing. A noble never brought just one outfit. Trunks overflowed with cloaks, gowns, hose, and shoes. A noble on the road might change clothes more often in a week than a peasant did in a lifetime. And heaven forbid a lord arrived at a castle looking wrinkled. Appearances, after all, were politics. So while peasants counted themselves lucky to find a corner of hay, nobles counted their luxuries: beds, baths, chapels, silks, all carefully hauled along, mile after mile. The road was the same for everyone, but the journey could not have been more different. If nobles had one universal rule of travel, it was this: never lift a finger yourself. That's what servants were for. And so, every noble journey meant a train of attendants. grooms for the horses, cooks for the meals, squires for the armor, valets for the clothing, and ladies in waiting to fuss over the noble's every whim. It was less traveling light, and more recreating a household wherever you went. Food was central. Nobles refused to rely on whatever stew was bubbling in a tavern pot. Instead, they dragged kitchens with them. Wagons groaned under spits, kettles, and sacks of spices. Servants butchered animals along the way, roasted meat over open fires, and seasoned dishes so the noble palate never had to endure blandness. Even on the road, dinner could be a full feast, complete with multiple courses. The difference from peasant food was staggering. While peasants boiled barley and hoped for a scrap of bacon, nobles on the road might be eating venison with pepper sauce, pastries stuffed with dried fruit, and wine spiced with cinnamon. Because why suffer when you could make the countryside smell like a banquet hall? And these meals weren't just private indulgence. They were displays. Guests invited to dine along the route were treated to a performance of wealth. Silver goblets set on wooden tables, servants in livery, and music drifting in the background. A noble never missed a chance to remind everyone that even in the mud, he was still above them. Entertainment followed the food. A traveling musician or jester might perform after supper, turning a random meadow into a temporary court. Storytelling, singing, and games kept spirits high, at least for the nobles. Servants, meanwhile, were probably still hauling water or scrubbing pans, because luxury had to come from someone's labor. So noble travel wasn't just about moving from one castle to another. It was about carrying the whole image of nobility along the way. Every roadside stop was a chance to eat richly, dress finely, and remind peasants staring from the hedgerows that yes, their betters lived very differently. If a count's entourage looked like a parade, then a king's journey resembled a full-scale migration. A royal household wasn't just a family, it was a government. And when the king moved, the machinery of the kingdom moved with him. Picture it, hundreds of people, sometimes even over 1,000, winding their way down muddy tracks. At the front, heralds and guards. Behind them, wagons creaking under the weight of trunks, tents, furniture, even documents of state. Then came the royal family, riding at a leisurely pace, surrounded by courtiers who tried to look elegant while also covered in dust. The king's court was portable. Clerks lugged chests of records and seals, ready to issue charters in the middle of nowhere. Priests and chaplains trailed along, setting up makeshift chapels for daily mass. Servants ran everywhere, fetching, cooking, cleaning, always a step away from exhaustion. And yes, the kitchens were massive. Imagine multiple wagons just for spices and cooking gear. Because heaven forbid the king eat bread that wasn't freshly baked. The sheer cost of all this was staggering. Horses had to be fed, wagons repaired, soldiers paid. Villagers along the route often dreaded royal visits because the court devoured food and supplies like a swarm of locusts. It was technically an honor, but more often it was a financial disaster for the locals. And yet, the spectacle mattered. The king's presence on the road wasn't just about travel. It was about visibility. Stopping in towns, holding court in borrowed halls, handing out favors or punishments. It reminded everyone who was in charge. The road itself became a stage for monarchy. So while peasants prayed for a bed of hay and nobles lounged on feather mattresses, kings and queens turned travel into statecraft. The journey was the message. Power on display, mile after muddy mile. When a peasant set out, they packed a crust of bread, maybe a blanket, and hoped for the best. When a noble traveled, it was a few trunks of clothes and a servant or two. But when a king or queen hit the road, it was basically a medieval circus. Minus the elephants, plus a mountain of velvet, the royal baggage train was legendary. Entire wagon loads carried furniture, drapes, silverware, and bed frames. Yes, bed frames. Monarchs weren't about to slum it on a straw pallet. Instead, carpenters and servants assembled wooden frames wherever the royal party stopped. draped them in embroidered cloth, and set feather mattresses on top. For short stays, they used folding beds, which was still fancier than anything most people would ever see. And then there were the tents. Imagine fields covered in great pavilions of brightly dyed canvas, striped in red, blue, or gold. These weren't little camping shelters. Some were big enough to serve as audience halls, complete with tapestries hung on the inside walls, chairs for courtiers, and braziers for warmth. Step inside, and it looked less like a campsite and more like a traveling palace. The kitchens traveled too. Multiple tents were set aside just for cooking. Fires roared, spits turned, pots simmered. Cooks had to feed not just the royals, but the entire moving army of attendants, guards, and hangers-on. A king's dinner might involve dozens of dishes, even on the road. Meanwhile, the servants ate whatever was left, usually boiled grains or thin broth. Then came the chapel tent. Because faith followed the crown, priests carried relics, chalices, vestments, and all the gear for daily services. Some kings even traveled with small, gilded altars that could be set up in a field. Imagine standing in a muddy meadow while a solemn mass was celebrated under a canvas roof, incense mixing with the smell of wet horses. The whole operation needed planners. Masters of the household scouted ahead, arranging lodgings and supplies. Scribes tracked expenses. Guards kept watch over the wagons. And always, at the center, was the royal figure, expected to appear serene, untouched by the chaos swirling all around. It was exhausting, expensive, and complicated, but it also showed the difference between ruler and subject. Peasants walked with blisters. Royals camped with chandeliers. The day usually began not with the king himself, but with his servants. Long before dawn, squires and attendants stirred. Fires were coaxed back to life, water fetched, and the royal tent aired out. If you think medieval monarchs woke up to peace and quiet, no, they woke up to people bustling around their bedside like a medieval stage crew. Breakfast was simple compared to the evening feast, but still fancy by peasant standards. Fresh bread, maybe a bit of cheese or cold meat, and of course ale or wine, because water was considered risky. The king might sip something light while clerks recited messages, or chaplains reminded him of today's saint. It wasn't exactly a lazy morning scroll through Instagram, but it had the same vibe of background noise before the day really began. Once the royal household packed up, the caravan lurched into motion. Horses clopped forward, wagons groaned, banners fluttered. The king rode near the center, surrounded by guards and courtiers. Traveling wasn't fast. 10, maybe 15 miles a day. Every bump and rut slowed the pace. At midday, they paused. Servants scrambled to set up a quick meal under awnings or in a borrowed barn. Nobles dined on meat pies, fruit, and spiced wine. The king might hold a few audiences, listening to local petitions or signing charters brought by clerks. Business never really stopped, even in the middle of a journey. By late afternoon, the scouts had chosen a stopping point. Out came the tents again, with practiced efficiency. Carpenters hammered, cooks lit fires, grooms tended horses. Within an hour or two, a field became a bustling encampment. Smoke rising, banners snapping, dogs barking, people shouting. It was chaotic, but organized chaos. Evenings were the highlight. The king dined in splendor, sometimes with invited guests from nearby towns. Tables groaned under roasts, stews, pastries, and flagons of wine. Musicians played, courtiers whispered gossip. And somewhere, at the far edge of camp, servants gnawed on crusts and slept in straw, utterly exhausted. Then, as night settled in, the tents glowed with torchlight. Guards patrolled, dogs growled, and the royal family sank into feather beds, while peasants outside stared at the glowing campfires and wondered how much all this cost. Spoiler, it was usually their taxes footing the bill. For a peasant family, life was steady in its dullness. Work the fields, tend the animals, pay the rents. Days blurred together in the same mud-colored rhythm. And then suddenly, the king was coming. News usually arrived ahead of time. Messengers or scouts rode through, announcing the royal household would stop for the night, which sounded exciting in theory, until villagers realized what it meant in practice. First, they had to provide food, and not just a basket of bread. We're talking livestock, grain, ale, and anything remotely edible. A royal court on the move ate like an army, and the locals footed the bill. Some towns nearly bankrupted themselves just trying to feed everyone for a few days. Hospitality, in this sense, was not optional. It was a command. Second, there was space. Inns might be cleared out for noble guests. Barns emptied to stable royal horses. Fields were trampled into makeshift camps. Tapestries might be borrowed from wealthy merchants to decorate halls. People gave up their best rooms, and if they complained, well, not the best idea when armed guards were standing around. And then there was the spectacle. For villagers who had never seen a crown or even a noble before, the arrival of the king was overwhelming. Trumpets blared, banners snapped in the wind, guards lined the streets. The royal family rode past on horseback, dripping with silks and jewels. To the peasants, it looked like something out of a storybook, half terrifying, half dazzling. The king might stop to accept petitions or distribute a few alms in a show of generosity. Children gawked, elders crossed themselves, and everyone whispered about how fine or how strange the royals looked, up close. And then, just as quickly as they came, the whole court packed up and left, leaving behind muddy fields, empty larders, and a population both thrilled and slightly poor for the experience. So for peasants on the road, a royal visit was like a natural disaster wrapped in pageantry, awe-inspiring but also costly, inconvenient, and impossible to ignore. Merchants, for example, usually rubbed their hands with glee. A royal court meant customers, and not just any customers, but deep-pocketed nobles eager to outspend each other. Jewelers sold trinkets, tailors stitched emergency outfits, innkeepers raised their rates sky high. The presence of royalty could turn an ordinary market into a sudden bonanza. Of course, merchants also had to hand over gifts to the crown, which were basically taxes with a ribbon tied on. Still, many saw it as worth the trade if they could brag later that a duke bought their silk. Clergy had a more delicate role. A bishop or abbot might scramble to prepare a grand welcome, complete with bells ringing and choirs singing. It was both a holy duty and a political performance. Hosting a king in a monastery could bring prestige, land donations, or future influence. But it could also mean feeding hundreds of freeloaders who ate like pigs and left the cloisters smelling like horses. Let's just say some abbots were more enthusiastic than others. Nobles of the region were usually torn between dread and excitement. On one hand, it was an honor to host a king, or even just to be seen in his company. On the other hand, it was expensive lending castles, providing feasts, and keeping their manners polished under royal scrutiny. A single clumsy mistake, like serving stale bread or forgetting proper protocol, could turn into a lasting embarrassment at court. And then, of course, there were the peasants. For them, the visit was mostly work. Hauling hay for royal horses, fetching water, cleaning streets, and giving up chickens or goats to the royal kitchens. They might catch a glimpse of the king riding past, which was exciting for about 10 seconds. Then they went back to empty cupboards and broken fences. So while everyone technically shared in the honor of a royal visit, the benefits flowed unevenly. Merchants counted profits, clergy counted blessings and expenses. Nobles counted risks, and peasants, well, they counted the days until life went back to normal. Royal travel wasn't just about logistics and ceremony. It was also about proximity. Hundreds of nobles, courtiers, and servants jammed together day after day, eating, drinking, and sleeping in the same sprawling camp. And when that many egos were forced into one muddy field, the gossip mill never stopped grinding. Courtiers whispered about who got the best tent placement, always a sign of favor. Being closer to the king's pavilion meant status. being shoved to the edge of camp with the servants. That was practically social exile. People noticed, and they talked. Marriages and affairs also provided endless material. Travel through nobles together in ways court life back in the palace didn't. Long rides, long evenings, too much wine. Suddenly, Lady So-and-so was looking a little too cozy with a handsome knight assigned to guard her. Servants noticed everything, and their chatter spread like wildfire, even if the official record stayed silent. Then there were rivalries. Nobles competed for the king's attention at every stop, offering advice, making jokes, slipping in compliments. A careless remark or a botched attempt at flattery could become tomorrow's entertainment for the rest of camp. Few things delighted bored courtiers more than watching someone else embarrass themselves. Even the royals weren't immune. A queen who frowned at her meal, a prince who drank too much, a princess who tripped in the mud. Little details became exaggerated tales by morning. It wasn't malicious most of the time. It was survival. Gossip kept people entertained through the endless monotony of travel. And of course, rumors about money swirled constantly. Who was paying for what? Which town had offered the fattest gifts? Was the king satisfied with the welcome, or secretly insulted? Nobody wanted to end up on the wrong side of those whispers, because royal memory, or at least the courtier's memory, was long. So while the peasants saw the royal caravan as a glittering parade, inside it was more like a soap opera on horseback. Intrigue, scandal, status games. Just slower, dustier, and occasionally interrupted by a priest reminding everyone to behave. No matter how carefully planned, royal journeys were messy. Roads turned to mud. Wagons broke down. Servants argued. And sometimes even kings found themselves looking less than majestic. Take the weather. A summer storm could drench the entire camp in minutes. Silk banners sagged, tents leaked, and feather beds turned soggy. Imagine a monarch trying to look dignified while his slippers squished with every step. Courtiers, of course, pretended nothing was wrong, even as their own finery wilted in the rain. Food mishaps were common too. On the road, cooks worked in rushed, uneven conditions. Meat sometimes spoiled, bread burned, or wine soured in the cask. Nobles grumbled in private, while servants quietly panicked. A bad dinner might not topple a dynasty, but it could certainly ruin an evening's mood. Accidents also happened. Horses stumbled, wagons tipped, nobles fell in the mud. There are stories of highborn ladies fainting from the heat or tumbling awkwardly off their saddles. Events that became the highlight of gossip for weeks. The king might laugh it off or glare in irritation. But either way, the story spread. And then there were the more serious embarrassments. Imagine arriving at a town to find the local lord unprepared, the feast half-cooked, the hall poorly decorated. Courtiers whispered about the insult. The king's face tightened, and the poor host's reputation sank instantly. Hosting royalty was like walking a tightrope. One slip, and everyone noticed. Even security wasn't foolproof. Bandits sometimes lurked near roads, hoping to snatch a stray wagon or servant. They rarely dared to attack the full caravan, but the idea of petty thieves stalking a royal party was humiliating enough. Guards doubled their patrols, and the rumors spread faster than the truth. So yes, the image of royalty on the move was supposed to be one of power and grace, but in practice, it often looked like a chaotic road trip, part parade, part disaster, part traveling gossip column. Behind the velvet curtains and gold embroidery was a lot of mud, sweat, and frantic improvisation. For most common travelers, the road wasn't a stage, it was a slog. Pilgrims made up a huge share of medieval wanderers. Peasants walking barefoot to shrines, clutching little tokens or wooden crosses. Some traveled in groups for safety, chanting prayers or singing hymns to pass the miles. Others went alone, quietly trudging along, hoping for a miracle cure or a spiritual reward. They didn't carry tents or feather beds. They carried what they could sling over a shoulder. A cloak, a loaf of bread, maybe a flask of ale. Nights were spent in barns, by church doors, or under hedgerows. If they were lucky, a monastery opened its gates. If not, they curled up under the stars and hoped it didn't rain. Merchants had it a bit easier. At least they had goods to sell. But their journeys were risky. A wagon full of cloth or spices was a tempting prize for bandits. Merchants traveled in caravans, armed with stout staffs or hired guards. They might stay at roadside inns, if they could afford it, and haggle with innkeepers over every crumb. Wanderers and beggars fared worst of all. They drifted from town to town, scraping by on alms, often unwelcome and eyed with suspicion. Authorities worried about vagrants spreading trouble. So many towns had strict rules about where the poor could sleep. For some, the only option was to bed down in ditches or ruined buildings just beyond the town gates. The road was dangerous in ways we don't often imagine. Wolves still prowled in some regions. Disease spread easily among travelers. And there was always the risk of being mistaken for someone else. A thief, a spy, or just a stranger at the wrong place, wrong time. So while royal caravans carried glitter and gossip, and nobles complained about soggy tents, the poor simply tried to survive the journey. Their stories rarely made it into chronicles, but the silent majority of footsteps on medieval roads belonged to them. Barefoot, weary, and invisible. For a pilgrim, the rhythm of the road was simple. If exhausting, wake at dawn, say a prayer, eat whatever crust of bread was left, and start walking. The miles passed slowly, marked only by fields, forests, and the occasional milestone or crumbling shrine. They didn't measure distance in numbers, but in aching feet and hours of daylight. Meals were basic: a crust of rye bread, maybe a lump of cheese, sometimes a hunk of salted fish if luck was kind. Water was scooped from streams, risky as it might be, or begged from villages. Ale was better, but too expensive to waste on every stop. Hunger was a steady companion, never quite gone. At night, choices were limited. A barn, if the farmer was generous, a monastery if the monks had space, or the hard ground if both turned them away. Cloaks doubled as blankets. Boots, if they had them, stayed on. Stories were told by firelight, or rosaries fingered in silence, until exhaustion finally forced sleep. Dangers weren't just wolves and bandits. Illness was constant. A blister could fester, a cough could linger, a fever could kill. Without money for a physician, pilgrims relied on prayers and herbs gathered by the roadside. Some never made it to their shrines, their journeys ending quietly in fields or ditches. And yet, there was fellowship. Pilgrims banded together, sharing food, songs, and protection. They wore badges of their chosen shrine, little pewter shells or crosses pinned to cloaks, so strangers could recognize them as fellow travelers with holy intent. A pilgrim badge was like a medieval passport, proof of purpose, a small shield against suspicion. Beggars and wanderers lived even closer to the edge. Without a shrine to justify their travels, they were often chased away from towns, forced to sleep outside gates or on open commons. For them, the road wasn't a spiritual path. It was survival, one uncertain step at a time. So while nobles grumbled about wet boots and kings demanded fresh meat on the table, pilgrims trudged barefoot through the mud, measuring progress not in luxury but in faith and sheer endurance. When we imagine medieval roads, we might picture neat cobblestones winding through the countryside. The truth was less elegant. Outside of a few Roman relics, still stubbornly clinging on in parts of Europe, most medieval roads were little more than dirt tracks, carved by generations of footsteps and cartwheels. In dry weather, they were dusty ruts. In rain, they turned into ankle-deep mud. Wagons sank, horses slipped, and travelers found themselves waiting rather than walking. Some roads simply disappeared after a storm, forcing people to hack through woods or cut across fields in search of the path again. Bridges were another issue. Roman stone bridges survived in places, but most crossings were humble wooden planks or fords. If the river was swollen, travelers had to wait, sometimes for days. Riskier souls tried to wade through and lost wagons, animals, or worse. It wasn't unusual to see shrines or crosses near bridges and fords, quiet reminders of those who hadn't made it across. Towns sometimes charged tolls for road use, claiming the money went toward maintenance. In reality, the funds often lined pockets instead of filling potholes. Travelers cursed these tolls, but there was little choice. Pay up or turn back. The King's Highway was often only slightly better than the cow track beside it. Nobles traveling with wagons had to plan routes carefully, because one broken wheel could delay an entire caravan. Pilgrims and peasants just trudged on, resigned to mud, dust, and sore feet. Still, the roads were lifelines. They connected villages to towns, merchants to markets, and pilgrims to shrines. Without them, isolation would have been complete. Travelers might hate the ruts and the mud, but they also depended on them. The road was freedom, however rough. So while kings paraded with banners and pilgrims limped along barefoot, all of them shared the same uneven tracks, groaning wagons, and endless mud. The road itself didn't care about status. It made everyone stumble, noble and peasant alike. In a world before GPS, or even reliable maps, most travelers relied on memory, landmarks, and word of mouth. If you knew the next town was a day's walk to the north, you didn't pull out a compass. You followed the road that looked the most trampled, prayed it didn't split in two, and asked the next shepherd you saw if you were still on the right track. Signs existed, but not many. Occasionally, there might be a carved stone marking a crossroads or a painted board pointing toward a market town. More often, churches and monasteries acted as guideposts. A spire in the distance was like a lighthouse, promising shelter, food, and hopefully the right direction. Pilgrims had it a little easier. Some shrines became so popular that routes developed around them. The Camino de Santiago in Spain, for example, had guidebooks written for pilgrims. Not that many could read them, but those who could passed the knowledge along. Still, most relied on the advice of locals. A kindly farmer might point the way, or a less kindly one might send you in circles just to get rid of you. Merchants, on the other hand, traveled in groups for safety and knowledge. Someone always knew the road to the next fair. Caravans often included experienced leaders who could judge by rivers, hills, and even the direction of moss on trees. It wasn't foolproof, but it worked better than trusting chance. And then there was the sky. Sunlight and stars were old friends of wanderers. A clear night gave rough orientation. A cloudy one left you stumbling in the dark, praying you hadn't wandered into the wrong valley. Of course, getting lost did happen often. And when it did, the best strategy was simply to keep walking until you hit a village or monastery. Medieval Europe was dotted with settlements, but the distances between could feel endless when you were hungry, wet, and unsure if you were circling back on yourself. So while kings had heralds to ride ahead and peasants had only their feet, both were at the mercy of roads that twisted, vanished, or led them to entirely unexpected places. Navigation was less a science than a gamble. Every traveler, from barefoot pilgrim to velvet-draped noble, shared the same fear: bandits. The medieval countryside could be lawless, especially in forests and borderlands. A lonely stretch of road was the perfect hunting ground for thieves who knew the terrain better than their victims. Bandits weren't usually dramatic highwaymen in plumed hats. That came later. Most were desperate men, sometimes former soldiers turned rogue, armed with clubs or rusty swords. They attacked the vulnerable, pilgrims, wandering beggars, or small merchant groups without guards. The richer caravans weren't immune either, though they often had armed escorts. Robbery wasn't the only threat. Sometimes travelers were beaten, sometimes worse. And since there were no quick response sheriffs waiting nearby, victims were left to limp on and hope someone found them before nightfall. This was one reason pilgrims tried to travel in groups. Safety in numbers, even if those numbers were just fellow barefoot wanderers with sticks. Then there were tolls. Medieval lords discovered that roads were profitable if you put a gate across them. Every bridge, every mountain pass, every town gate might demand a fee. In theory, these tolls funded road maintenance. In practice, they padded the coffers of whoever owned the land. Merchants grumbled the loudest, since tolls ate into profits. But even peasants on pilgrimage had to scrape coins together. Sometimes the toll collectors looked suspiciously like bandits in uniform. The line between lawful and lawless was thin. Suspicion also plagued travelers. A stranger arriving at a village could be welcomed with bread, or with mistrust. Outsiders were often blamed for thefts, disease, or just bad luck. Some towns required papers or tokens proving you were a pilgrim, not a wanderer without cause. Without them, you might be refused entry or pushed to sleep outside the gates. So while the road was a thread connecting kingdoms, it was also fraught with danger. Wolves howled, yes, but the real predators were often human, lurking in forests, standing at toll gates, or waiting behind town walls to decide whether you were welcome or not. In the Middle Ages, travel wasn't just a physical act, it was wrapped in spiritual meaning. If you were a pilgrim, you weren't simply trudging down muddy tracks. You were supposedly on God's highway. And, naturally, the church found ways to make this visible. Enter the pilgrim badge. Pilgrim badges were little metal tokens, often made of lead or pewter, stamped with a symbol of the holy site you visited. Think of them as the medieval version of a fridge magnet. Except instead of showing off where you'd been, they also doubled as a kind of spiritual ID card. A shell badge meant Santiago de Compostela. A tiny ampulla flask meant Canterbury, and so on. They were cheap, mass-produced, and sold in vast quantities at shrines. Wearing one of these on your cloak or hat announced, "I am not just some wandering peasant, I'm on a holy mission." In theory, this was supposed to offer protection. Bandits might think twice about robbing someone marked as God's traveler. Though, let's be honest, not every thief was swayed by piety when hungry. More importantly, the badge offered recognition. Inns, villages, and towns knew what pilgrims looked like, and the badge could mean the difference between being turned away or being given a bowl of soup and a spot by the fire. The church also promised a kind of divine insurance policy. Pilgrims were blessed before leaving, and some popes declared that anyone harming them risked excommunication, which sounds powerful. But again, a robber hiding in the woods might not stop mid-attack to worry about PayPal decrees. Still, the spiritual weight mattered. Pilgrims carried prayers, charms, and blessings, as if these could smooth the journey. Some even wore little lead crosses or stitched verses into their clothing, hoping that a line of scripture could deflect disease or misfortune. These weren't just accessories, they were armor of a kind, not against wolves or toll collectors, but against the unpredictable fears of the road. So in an age where few had maps or money, what pilgrims often carried was faith strapped to their hats in the form of badges glowing faintly with the promise of divine favor. Even if the mud and mosquitoes didn't quite respect it, travel meant food, and food meant preparation. Poor peasants didn't exactly pack glamorous lunches. There was no roasted chicken wrapped in linen, no sweetmeats tucked away for a midnight snack. Instead, the road diet was brutally simple. Bread, more bread, and maybe a little cheese if you were lucky. Hard bread was a traveler's best friend, not because it was delicious, but because it refused to rot. You could gnaw at the same hunk for days. It might break a tooth before it broke down on its own. Cheese was another staple, often hard and salty, meant to last. Salted fish was common too, if you had access to it, though carrying it around in summer probably didn't make you popular with fellow travelers. Meat, rare. Peasants didn't kill animals just to bring along as snacks. Chickens were worth more alive for their eggs, and pigs were investments. But dried meat scraps, maybe left over from feast days, could occasionally make an appearance in the sack. And then there was the travel flask. Wine, if you had coin. Ale if you were practical, water if you had no choice. Fresh water wasn't always safe, so beer and weak ale were safer bets. Pilgrims sometimes carried little gourds or flasks. Not glamorous, but at least they kept a drink off your clothing. Cooking on the road was trickier. If you carried grain or beans, you needed fire and time to cook them, which wasn't always possible. So most peasants simply ate cold food, bread, cheese, dried whatever, and hoped they'd find a hearth at night where they could soften things in broth. And of course, hunger was a constant companion. Many peasants set out with just enough food for a few days, hoping to beg, buy, or barter the rest along the way. Pilgrimage routes became lined with sellers, women hawking pies, men offering bread loaves, the medieval equivalent of highway food stalls. Prices were higher than at home because, well, they knew you were desperate. So the road diet was less about enjoying yourself and more about enduring. You weren't savoring flavors. You were just trying to keep enough strength in your legs to make it to the next muddy mile marker. Peasants didn't have the luxury of choosing the perfect season for a journey. Sometimes the landlord's business, a pilgrimage vow, or a desperate search for work meant setting out whether the sky was friendly or not. And the sky, most of the time, was not. Rain was the biggest nuisance. Roads turned into swampy messes almost instantly. A steady downpour could soak wool cloaks until they hung like lead blankets, and shoes, if you even had decent ones, would squelch with every step. There was no such thing as waterproofing. Not really. Oilcloth and waxed leather existed, but poor travelers rarely had access to them. So you got wet, and you stayed wet, which meant shivering at night and praying you didn't catch a cough that lingered into something worse. Cold was another killer. Winter journeys were harsh, but sometimes unavoidable. Frost bit through layers of wool, and snow made roads impassable. Travelers trudged along, leaving footprints that vanished quickly behind them, while the wind stole body heat faster than you could generate it. If you found shelter, you were lucky. If not, you huddled under trees or in barns, teeth chattering, hoping the night passed quickly. Heat wasn't much kinder. Summer meant dust choking your lungs, the sun beating down on bare necks, and the risk of heat stroke long before anyone had a word for it. Wells and streams were salvation, but they weren't always nearby. Many a peasant traveler probably staggered into villages half dehydrated, begging for water before they begged for food. And storms. Storms turned everything terrifying. Thunder cracked across the sky like divine punishment. Rain lashed down, and wind could tear the thatch from poor huts. Imagine what it did to a peasant trudging on an open road. Lightning was feared as a direct sign of God's displeasure, so travelers might clutch charms or mutter prayers as they tried to endure. Weather, in short, was not background scenery. It was the main actor, the uninvited companion that shaped every step of the journey. And for the poor, without carriages, without furs, without servants to build fires, it was often the difference between survival and collapse. When no inn opened its doors, no monastery offered shelter, and the village gate was shut tight, peasants had to make do with whatever patch of earth they could claim for the night, and that meant improvisation. The most basic trick was the hedge. Medieval hedgerows, thick with tangled branches, weren't just for marking property lines. They offered a kind of natural wall. Curling up in the lee of a hedge gave some protection from wind. And if you tucked yourself deep enough, maybe even a bit of privacy from prying eyes. The problem, of course, was thorns. Better to endure scratches than freeze in the open. Though trees were another go-to. Not in the romantic sense of climbing up and sleeping in the branches. That was more likely to end with a broken neck. But the base of a broad oak or beech provided a canopy. Leaning against a trunk under a cloak could mean the difference between drenched or merely damp. Forests, however, had their own dangers. Animals, robbers, and the creeping sense of being unwelcome on land that always seemed to belong to someone else. Some peasants carried little more than a blanket or a rough cloak. At night, these became their only defense. Travelers might wrap their feet in spare cloth to keep off frostbite or roll themselves in straw if they could find a pile near a field. Barns, if you could sneak into one, were almost luxurious, warm from animals, soft with hay, though you risked being chased out by an angry farmer in the morning. Fires were rare for lone travelers. Striking flint and carrying tinder wasn't a common peasant skill, and smoke meant attention. A fire might draw warmth, but it could also draw thieves. So most nights were passed in the dark, teeth chattering, waiting for dawn. And then there was hunger. Sleeping rough on an empty stomach was its own kind of torment. Some peasants chewed on herbs or roots, anything to trick the body into believing it had eaten. Others tightened belts around their waists to dull the pangs. So, the road at night wasn't just uncomfortable. It was survival in its most basic form. Find cover, stay alive until morning, and hope the next village was kinder. For centuries, monasteries weren't just religious centers. They were the medieval equivalent of travel stations, dotted across Europe like oases in a desert. And for poor peasants trudging along muddy tracks, they were often the only dependable refuge. Monks followed rules of hospitality that came from scripture. The idea was simple. Every guest was to be received as if they were Christ himself. Of course, this noble principle sometimes collided with reality, like when endless streams of dirty, sick, and hungry travelers appeared day after day. But still, monasteries took in far more than most lords or villagers ever did. What did you get if you were lucky enough to be admitted? First, food. Not feasts, but enough to keep you moving. Bread, broth, maybe cheese, and sometimes ale or weak wine. It wasn't a lavish spread, but compared to chewing on stale crusts by the roadside, it was heavenly. Second, shelter. Monks didn't tuck travelers into feather beds. Those were for the monks themselves. But guest houses existed at many monasteries, basic dormitories where pilgrims and poor wanderers could sleep under a roof. Even a straw pallet on the floor was a blessing when the alternative was frostbitten grass. Third, care. Some monasteries had infirmaries, and sick travelers might be treated, at least in the rudimentary ways available at the time. Herbs, bandages, prayers. For the chronically ill, it was a chance to rest without being turned away. But monasteries weren't purely charitable. They kept careful watch. Too many visitors could spread disease or cause trouble, and there were always suspicions about thieves masquerading as pilgrims. Some houses imposed limits, a night or two of shelter, no more. Others only admitted those who could show a pilgrim's token. Still, monasteries formed a kind of safety net. Without them, many journeys would have ended in ditches. They were the places where divine ideals actually touched the muddy, blistered reality of travel. And for peasants, they were among the rare spots where poverty wasn't an automatic reason to be shoved away. Monastic hospitality wasn't just a vague idea. It was organized, almost like a system. When a traveler arrived, they didn't simply stroll in and help themselves to bread and ale. There were steps, small rituals, and, naturally, plenty of rules. First came the greeting. In Benedictine monasteries especially, the porter, the monk stationed at the entrance, was the first point of contact. His entire job was to manage the threshold. Imagine him as the medieval receptionist, except dressed in a habit and with more responsibility for souls than for paperwork. He'd welcome the traveler with a blessing, often quoting scripture. "Thanks be to God, you have come." Then came the washing. Hospitality often included the ritual washing of a guest's hands, and sometimes even their feet. This was more than hygiene, though, frankly, it helped there too. It was symbolic, recalling the washing of feet in the Bible. For a poor peasant who'd been slogging through mud for days, it must have felt both humbling and oddly comforting. Food came next. Meals were simple, taken in the guest refectory. Monks and guests didn't usually eat together. Though exceptions existed, the food was basic. Bread, soup, maybe beans or fish on a good day. Rich nobles might bring donations and earn themselves a better spread, but the poor received the standard fare. Still, it was hot and it was plentiful compared to roadside begging. Sleeping arrangements were plain. Guest houses or dormitories existed, with straw bedding and communal spaces. Privacy wasn't part of the package. You lay down alongside other pilgrims, tradesmen, and wanderers, hoping your neighbor didn't snore louder than the monastery bells. And there were limits. Hospitality was Christian duty, but monasteries weren't hotels. A night or two was common, 3 at most. Then, politely but firmly, the guest was expected to move on. After all, too many pilgrims were simply wanderers looking for endless free meals. Monks knew the difference, even if they rarely admitted it outright. Despite these boundaries, the monastery represented a rare moment of dignity for the poorest on the road. They were received not as nuisances, but as guests, briefly lifted out of the mud and treated, however simply, as souls worth serving. Outside monasteries, hospitality was, let's just say, inconsistent. Villages weren't designed to handle waves of outsiders, and most peasants were already struggling to feed their own families. So when a ragged traveler appeared at the gate, the welcome depended on mood, luck, and the state of the harvest. Some travelers tried begging outright, a knock at a cottage door, a plea for bread, maybe a scrap of cheese. If the household had a crumb to spare, they might offer it. Christian charity was a duty, after all, and most villagers feared being seen as cruel. But more often than not, the answer was, "We barely have enough for ourselves," which was true. Rural life wasn't a feast. Towns were trickier, gates were often locked at night, and strangers who showed up late might be left to sleep against a wall outside. During the day, beggars clustered near churches or marketplaces, holding out hands and muttering prayers. Some towns even issued beggar licenses to control who was allowed to ask for alms, meaning a wandering stranger could be accused of being an illegal beggar. Yes, bureaucracy even found a way to haunt the hungry. Then there were inns, technically available to all, but in reality, designed for those who could pay. A peasant with a few coppers might buy space on a bench or a patch of floor near the hearth. Without coins, though, the innkeeper was unlikely to take pity. Inns were businesses, not shelters. Stories of travelers sleeping upright in corners, clutching their belongings, while the wealthy snored in feather beds upstairs, were not uncommon. And of course, suspicion always hung in the air. Strangers could be thieves, spreaders of plague, or spies from a rival lord. Villagers might mutter, cross themselves, or bar the door. A lone peasant wandering into a hamlet could find themselves more a source of fear than of pity. So, for many poor travelers, charity wasn't something you counted on. It was a gamble. You knocked, you prayed, and sometimes you received bread. Other times, you were told to move on. Back into the road, back into the mud, back into the uncertainty of where you might rest your head that night. And that's all for today. Now, give your eyes a little rest and think about the journey we've traveled together. We'll meet again. Good night.